So I need to thank Wyatt and Cherie and Kaki and Kevin and all of the staff, and particularly to thank Claudia Emerson, who's been just a joy to teach with, and the members of our workshop who have just given us a week of really generous and smart conversation about this art that we practice. I also want to thank the person who scheduled me to give the last craft lecture. I can't tell you how grateful I am. Because it gave me a chance to follow up a lot of really brilliant, graceful craft lectures, half of which were about the inanity and futility of craft lectures. And I was thinking in response to that, the best thing to do would be give a short craft lecture. The shortest one I know is by Dickens. When he was asked how he wrote the Pickwick Papers, he said, "I thought of Pickwick." That was his 4-word craft lecture. His friend Wilkie Collins expanded it to 7, asked if there are rules for writing a novel. He said, yes, make them laugh, make them cry, and make them wait. That was his formula. Somewhat longer, the 18th century poet Busan, poet and painter, great poet, was asked if there was any secret to writing haiku, and he said, yes, there is. It's to be plain without being vulgar. And the students said, how can that be learned? And he said, yes, read Chinese poetry, which is a really good craft lecture. Right there, a good one. And the other one that came to me was the Frank O'Connor, the Irish short story writer, was asked if there are any rules for writing, and he said, just one, you can't revise nothing. However, like Paget, I feel obligated to earn my money, and I actually have a subject to talk about, which is form. I've written a little book on form called A Little Book on Form. It's still in process, and I thought I was going to get away with reading it, but when I started to try to read it aloud, I bored myself so much that I felt like I couldn't quite get there, and I was thinking of coming at it. I don't know if you find, but I find with exposition, with essays, not with poems, because poems just happen pretty much, but that I always have 2 or 3 ways to begin, and I can not begin for months because of these different possibilities. Balaam's ass starving between 2 equidistant bales of hay. And then remembered that essay means try. That one way in would have begun with an image of a grave, and the other way with a song. And as I was running this morning, I thought, on a green, humid, sunny Friday morning, it's obviously a better idea to begin with the grave and end with the song than to begin with the song and end with the grave. So I want to talk about form, and I want to tell you about a grave. Archaeologists and anthropologists used to think that the threshold at which we glimpsed what it meant to be human was the making of tools. It's become clearer and clearer that lots of creatures make tools, and several hominid species made tools as well. So the threshold of the recognition of the emergence of specifically human consciousness has become, for anthropologists and archaeologists, evidence of ritual behavior around death and burial. And I Googled last night, because I'd not read about this subject in a while, and the evidence is murkier than it was. Maybe burial is 200,000 years old. Maybe a lot of people think that that's accidental. Maybe it's only about 130,000 years old. Ritual burial, it's a bit unclear. When I first read about it, the oldest known instance of ritual burial was a grave found in what's now the Ukraine, in the steppes, the area of Chekhov's great short novel. They found the grave of a child, a boy child, they think, approximately 10 years old, curled as if asleep on its side, and set around it in a symmetrical pattern were 3 pair of ram's horns. First evidence of being human was evidence of the ritual making of symbols in a ritual and formal pattern. So when I say I want to talk to you about form, it means I want to talk to you about what we do and the very roots of our being in our daily practice of doing this. There are a couple of interesting things, touching things about that grave. Probably the ram's horns are symbols. We don't know of what. Around that area in Iraq and as far south as Israel, early graves have lots of images of rams. And the earliest grave uncovered in Israel, about 9,000, 10,000 years old, it's around the time the first city at Troy, the time of the first migration across the land bridge. This country, in a grave in Israel, there's a drawing of a goddess giving birth to a ram. So because they're pastoral peoples, probably rams were associated with plenty and good fortune and good luck. And so there's something of, if that's the symbol of pathos, with these carefully placed ram's horns around the child's grave. And then, for what I'm interested in, this interesting pattern of 3 and 2. 2 sets in the shape of 3. And I found myself thinking, why 3 for a small child? And thought, it's evident that 2 would be too few. I don't know why. And there's something wrong with the child with 4. 3 is perfect, maybe for the size, maybe because we have a top and a middle and a bottom, that may be something like that. But the 3 mattered and seemed right. And it's 3 playing off of 2 to make a pattern that's bilaterally symmetrical. Because it's another thing we know about human beings from the outset is that partly because I'm sure of whatever reasons in the nature that we were born into, bilateral symmetry is one of our basic ideas of what's beautiful, what's functional. And so when we make form, that's also going to be one of the ideas about it. So my next thought, I stop and say that a really beautiful pond turtle crossed my path just as I was having this thought up near the equestrian center, half the size of a cantaloupe, orange and green, going along, stopped to wait to see what I was and whether I was going to turn into something else or not. Red eye fixed in me like that. And I was thinking about an idiotic song lyric that has been stuck in my head for an entire week, thanks to a friend who sent me a tasteless CD just before I got here. And that made me think about rhythm and fixation and the song lyric. I can't sing, I can't carry a tune. I asked Emily if she would sing for me, and she said, "Are you kidding?" The song goes, "What'll I do when you are far away, when I am blue? What'll I do?" I can't get it out of my head. And I was thinking that the phrase, "what'll I do," is what in metrics I think of as a cradle. That is, it has a stressed syllable and 2 unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable like that. And it's rapid. And then you get 3 rising iambs. So you get a pattern of 2 and 3 like the ram's horns. And then to follow it up, whoever did that bit of play decided to cut the 3 to 2 and cross them. And did "When I am blue," 2 little rising iambs, "what'll I do?" maybe could inflict it on you. If someone could sing it now, maybe you could. Anybody here sing it? What'll I do when and then I thought it's more intricate than that, because do is a long vowel sound. What'll I do when you, long vowel sound, are, as Charles was talking about Greek book, are far away. Yeah. It's so sweet. It's so incredibly sweet. Thank you. So a rapid 2 with short vowels, and then a very slow 3, followed by a slow 2 with also open vowels, and the cradle again, the short thing. It's kind of a brilliant little structure, and I also had the thought, because I have a new grandchild, as I was running and thinking about this, that I reminded myself of a baby studying a rattle. You know, when they first grasp it and kind of look at it like that. And I thought, I get it, the baby is workshopping the rattle. And then I found myself playing another form that does exactly what the cradle does in traditional prosody of English. Most of these are based on some fact about the language, and another 4-syllable phrase that substitutes for a couple of iambic rising phrases is the prepositional phrase. If it has a monosyllabic preposition, a monosyllabic adjective, and a monosyllabic noun, which a lot of words in English do, in a dark wood becomes a phrase. And I don't know if you know, Wyatt or Charles, or who invented the calling attention to the fact that it's actually a portmanteau phrase that belongs to the language that fills in I think maybe John Hollander invented the term for it, double I am. But the thing about it is in a dark wood. And I thought if you applied to it the principle of what'll I do, you'd get, borrowing from Rilke's poem, In a Dark Time, you get something like, in a dark wood, the eye begins to see. And if you played that same trick but shortened it even more, you could get, in a dark wood, the eye begins to see, or could, in a dark wood. And if you gave it a title, like Rilke gave to one of his poems, The Waking, it might even make a poem, The Waking. In a dark wood, the eye begins to see, or could, in a dark wood. Not bad. And if you were Jill McConkie, you might go, in a dark wood, the eye begins to see, or could, in a dark wood. And the additional syllable would give a terrible sweetness and wistfulness to that phrase and make a completely different poem. As you notice, what happened to me when I started thinking about this subject is that I started playing. At the very core of our natures, we are symbol-making creatures who play with rhythms and rhythmic patterns. And we play with rhythms and rhythmic patterns. Why? That's the next step. Why do we do, is that right? That's the next step? Yeah. What is rhythm and why do we do it? So this is all supposed to be peroration to my lecture. I'm looking at the time. So the obvious thing about a rhythm is that you, first of all, need repeated sound. I guess that's, in a way, the simplest rhythm, though we don't think of absolute pure repetition, I think, as a human rhythm. I was thinking again this morning about the katydids. It doesn't sound human because they're not playing. I think the males are trying to attract females with single-mindedness that does seem male, if not human. And but they're not playing. They're going like that. And human rhythms happen when you start playing. And in order to play, you need to go away from something that's been established, and then you need to come back. Or not go back, have it turn into something else. So the first part is because we're also we're pattern discerning creatures for our own safety. The first thing that happens when we come into any environment is we listen to see if everything is familiar, and when it's not familiar, we look and we notice. So a clue to the whole business of rhythm is regular patterns make us feel safe, and movement away from irregular patterns wakes us up, makes us notice those two things. That seems to be at the core of this thing that we do. And at the core of the way, therefore, I was thinking rhythmic form gets made. And you could notice about this business with rhythmic play that this a thing of a constant and variable, which is the obvious thing people who do music and do prosody and poetry say that you need in order to get started, is that it's the fundamental principle of the generation of all life. At the core of the gene pool is the fact that we throw up things constant enough to stay near the genotype and stuff different enough to create the possibility of change, the elasticity of change. And that helps with why human beings are involved with rhythm. We're playing with this fundamental dance we do in our being every minute of the day, paying attention, not paying attention, listening closely to rhythms, going away from rhythms, coming back from rhythms. It's what we fundamentally do, and it's not very conscious in us that we do it most of the time. And when people aren't doing it to survive, they're doing it for fun, in the rhythms of the music they listen to, in the predictable rhythms of the television shows they like to watch, in the reassurance of the structure of baseball games and football games and other ritual events and so on. Our life is constantly engaged with this deep experience of formal rhythm, and artists are people who play with it on purpose, who either need to or decide to get to do that. The thing about the constant and the variable when you turn to poetry is you know that if the phrase is repeated over and over again, it can scare you and make you. There are stories of people who recite over certain kinds of prayers, pray for us sinners now at the hour of our death, amen, pray for us sinners now at the hour of our death, amen, that they go into it, especially if you rock with it. In fact, if I encouraged all of you to sit here for a few minutes saying one of those ejaculations and rock back and forth, you would freak out in short order. We want safety, and repetition makes us feel trapped. So we want freedom, and too much of it makes us feel like there's no principle of control at all. So probably what's going on. And this problem of our love of freedom and our love of repetition is not at the root of our evolution, but it's recapitulated in the process of a child growing up. The first job is to be safe, and the second job is to individuate. So variation from the sound imitates individuation, and it's probably why in our relationships most of the time we either are feeling too connected or not connected enough, and that people are always trying to work it out. I'm going to talk in a minute about the line. One of the wonderful lines as part of the Unit 1 is John Donne's "Whatever dies was not mixed equally." We are not mixed equally. When we have lots of togetherness we start hungering for our solitude. When we have our solitude, we start hungering for company and companionship. Most of the time in life, we're trying to figure out the right ratio between being connected and not being connected, to being with people and being separate from people. And formal play is clearly endless play with, given a particular symbolic subject, getting right the relationship between repetition and variation, getting right the dialectic of freedom and safety in our lives. Wild nights were I with thee, wild nights would be our luxury, futile the wind to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart, rowing in Eden, the sea, might I but moor tonight in thee. I'm not going to analyze that poem, but it's about freedom and safety. You get to throw out the charts and be in port and have the storm all at once. It's a little imagination that the right amount is wildness and freedom in perfect combination, and there's a reason that I may come to on why that's a 4-line poem, or 2 stanzas of 4-line poems, because something that happens with 4-ness. So the next part of this little meditation is what happens is, in my little book, is a little essay on oneness and a little essay on 2-ness and a little essay on 3-ness and a little essay on 4-ness in poetry. And what I want to try to do now is condense those into about 15 minutes here. But the idea is, for me, was to think with this business of rhythm, when we think about art, how out of what units it's built up. And if you think about it, starting with poetry, and I think with a musician would say start with a bar of music, and perhaps an artist would say start with a line. You begin with 1 unit, and then you have 2 units. And in the case of poetry, I think once you get to 3 units, once you get to go from a single line to a couplet, and from a couplet to what's sometimes called a tercet or a triplet, something that makes 3 lines a unit, to something that makes 4 lines, then every other literary form can be generated out of those numbers. A sonnet is 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 2, or a tanka is 3 plus 2, so on. The Arabic and Urdu ghazal is 2, 2, 2, 2, so on. All the forms play off those forms. Numbers falling through numbers, falling through numbers in this infinite play that we do. So this, I'm going to begin with 1. I may only get through 1, but we'll see, whatever we get done here. A single line is a naked thing. For that reason, it's both light and heavy. Only a line. Like a sparrow's breast, it only weighs about as much as a tea bag. But it's complete, which gives it a certain kind of weight. It's the basic unit of all lyric forms. 2 of them make a couplet. Or in the work songs of the Bantu people, something that they call a combination. 3 of them make a blues lyric or a stanza of Dante's Terza Rima, 4 a hymn stanza or a ballad stanza or a Chinese quatrain, 5 in the Japanese make a tanka, and so on. If we get 1, we can get 2, we can get most of the rest. Important information for poets. It's much easier, Robert Lowell said, to write a good poem than a good line. I don't think I think there is no craft involved in writing a good line. God does that or something. Robert Duncan, the short line we refine and keep for candor. The long line rolls out as it needs to its end. So this is another business of play with the line. The first formal fact in poetry about the single line is that it either matches a completed or partially completed grammatical sense. April is the cruelest month, or it doesn't. April is the cruelest month mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And from this fact, that a line can either sit still or turn over, derives the term verse, which means a turning, and the kinds of energy of movement that happens in the play of rhythm that generates poetry. If a line makes a completed sense, it's heir and hostage to the structure of English grammar in which something happens to something, noun, verb, object. Worms will try your long-preserved virginity, or has the quality of something. The art of losing isn't hard to master. All things that love the sun are out of doors. Even in contemporary experimental, non-representational poetry, ink of this Egyptian knock it overnight has a ghost of syntax clinging about it. The hidden paradigm of the single line that's completed, of course, is the sentence, without which there can be no idea of enjambment. And the sentence imitates insight, which is to say, it imitates individuation, the becoming, the thought that separates us from others and gives us a self. I think that's an important notion for thinking about what the basic unit is in a poem. And it made me try to think about how this would be useful to the playwrights and the storytellers here, that the particular formal arc of a story or a play, of a narrative, is a sentence. That is to say, the beginning and the middle and end in a narrative mimic the noun, verb, object. That is to say, as Beth said, the beginning is desire, the middle is action, and the end is consequence. So when you come out of a play or a movie, or if you've been told a story, you've been given a sentence, and you walk out individuated in some way by that experience. And obviously, there are an incredible number of different interior rhythms in which that could happen. I think in Jill's story, it happens with the idea of 4 different territories converging on one consequence, which is partly terrible and partly lyrical and happy, and feels either like fatality or grace, depending on how you weigh the way that has been put together. In Paget's Endless Sentences is in fact an example of a structure that refuses the couplet or the triplet is just one question after another, as if it was necessary to infinitely postpone any idea of the resolution of a rhythm because something awful was going to happen if you did. Or in his case, either awful or really banal, which would be one idea of awful. I solved the problem with that mosquito by just swallowing it. One of my friends and mentors is Robert Aitken Roshi, the Roshi of the Diamond Sangha on Hawaii. He's a wonderful Buddhist teacher, and he was in a bookstore once with a bunch of students sitting looking up at him awed, and one of them in the Q&A said, "Master, do you swat mosquitoes?" And he said, "Yeah, I live in Hawaii. Yes, I do." And they said, "And what do you think?" And he said, "I think better luck next time." Being in one way of thinking, the interesting thing about the sentence, about the work of art as a sentence, is that it's an action and it ends, or has an ending, maybe more of an ending than anything in life does. Life is a process. We are verbs, not nouns, us people. We're verbs until we die. Then we become nouns, maybe. But the sentence gives us noun-like. Well, it hasn't decided yet. So I have quite a long riff on this, and I'm going to skip it. But you get the idea. The idea roughly is that I think in the individual sentence, in the individual line, in the individual completed work of art, there is a tension between action and stillness that is a source of endless paradox, because we feel paradoxically the play between being and becoming in ourselves at all times. And so while we're playing with recurrence and rhythm, how much we want reassurance in the sound of a poem or in the structure of a painting or in the order of a story, and how much we want something chaotic. One of the extraordinary things I thought about Randall's story last night was the replication at different levels of what was a perception of the essential act of kidnapping on which our republic was based from the get-go. And you felt out of that chaos this rather terrifying rhythm emerging. And that's an example inside a storytelling which has a da-da-da-da, that many other rhythms, obviously subplots are a way of setting up those kind of parallel rhythms that are just as much play of form as drumming is. You know what I mean? That's my theme, I guess, today. Greek mathematicians did not think one was a number because the concept one did not involve number. To them, 2 was the first number. And the hybrid marriage of 1, which was not a number, and 2, which begot 3, the second number, and the hybrid marriage of 1, which was not a number, and 2, which was, begot 3, the second number, and from 1, 2, and 3, all other numbers proceeded, so that all odd numbers had in them an element that was not number. This is why Plato said the leap from 1 to 2 in human beings was the leap, actually had Socrates say it, was the leap to rationality. It's why Leonard Bernstein, probably speaking of music, said that 2 was the rhythm of the body and 3 was the rhythm of the mind. I told this to someone who said he'd always heard that 3 was the rhythm of the body, 2 is the rhythm of the mind. So apparently not everyone has weighed in on this subject yet. But it does make sense to me to think of 3 as the mixed generative form, the one that generates more things, the play of odd against even, and that the ground beat of being is 2, and that the spinning of becoming is in the 3s. Here are some memorable one-sentence lines. I sought my death and found it in my tomb, 1586. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song, 1596. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, 1598. Those are pearls that were his eyes, 1611. Gut eats all day and leches through the night, 1621. For God's sakes, hold your tongue and let me love. Probably written in 1598, published in 1633. I am a little world made cunningly, 1635. Is all good structure in a winding stair, 1638, and so on. Gorgeous, this thing, the line. Gorgeous, a good line of poetry. Amazing and a miracle every time. The one-line poem in Japanese, as far as I know, is the only kind, and it's a mixed case, the haiku. It has a 3-part prosodic structure, of course, 5-syllable, 7-syllable, 5-syllable, but as written in Japanese, it is usually represented in a single line, and there's a long controversy about whether it should be translated as a 1-line or a 3-line poem. Aoki Sato is probably the best 1-line translator of haiku. His versions can be found in From the Country of 8 Islands, an anthology of Japanese poetry. Here are several of his translations of basho. Crow just settled on a bare branch autumn evening. Snowy morning by myself eating salmon jerky. Here's probably the best nature poem ever written. As for the hibiscus on the roadside, my horse ate it. Here's a summer poem. A bee staggers out of a peony. Here's another one. First snow falling on a half-finished bridge. Here's his translation of a few by Busan. I go, you stay, 2 autumns. Notice in that genius of a poem, it has the 3 elements, I go, you stay, 2 autumns, the 3-ness. It also has a 2-ness because of the seasonal reference, I go, you stay, 2 autumns. The seasonal thing always defines the other. So actually in this little form, like in the song lyric, as in the burial mound, there's an absolutely intricate play of 1, 2, and 3 running through it. Apprentice's day off, hops over kite string, keeps going. Mad girl in the boat at midday, spring currents. Farmers goes out to check his scarecrow, comes back. Goes out, comes back, love life of a cat. That's Isa. Deer licking first frost from one another's coats. There aren't many one-line poems in English, but Allen Ginsberg has made an interesting proposition about one-line poems. When he read W.C. Handy's autobiography, Handy claims to be the father of the blues because classically trained, one of the first black men in the South who could get an education in a school by way of learning music, was in, how's this go? He recalled W.C. Handy writing the first blues he ever heard, played by a black man at a train station in Independence, Missouri, to a kind of chord and a guitar that he had never heard the like of before, that he repeated over and over again as he repeated the lyric, which went like this: I walked here from East St. Louis and I ain't got one thin dime. And Allen Ginsberg said, bingo, that was the first American haiku. That was the first time the American land and its history and the English language and the millenarian politics of Christianity as the African Americans learned it, made a completely authentic new American art form, and that the lines of the great blues songs were in fact the American haiku. I hate to see that evening sun go down. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. No hiding place down here. Swing low, sweet chariot. Blackbird sitting on the tree of life. Good morning, blues. Blues, how do you do? If you don't like ocean, don't fish my sea. Memphis Minnie, ain't no use to wandering, neither to strutting around. Just make me a pallet on the floor, blood red river and a rocking chair, which spills over into the popular lyric which took off from it. The Mississippi Delta is shining like a national guitar. I wish I had a river I could skate away on, lay across my big brass bed. Allen Ginsberg tried in his last book of poems to adapt this by writing one-line poems about his life in New York, which he called American Sentences. And this is his name for the proposition of a one-line poetry in America that you now have to pick up and take care of and write. His are not very good, but he's giving it a shot. And he uses titles: Thompson Square, Lower East Side, New York. 4 skinheads stand in the streetlight rain chatting under an umbrella. I guess what he had in mind was the tension between their tough guy dress and being huddled together under an umbrella, which was less, punkishly lone. Another one is dated November 1991, New York. Put on my tie in a taxi, short of breath, rushing to meditation. There is a poet in San Francisco named Carol Snow who did a little book called Breath As, of one-line poems, some of which are quite lovely. This one is just called For K, capital. Then Kathy, is that mine? She said, ran out to the crying in the yard. I thought it was a wonderful little poem about mothers. Then Kathy, is that mine? Ran out to the crying in the yard. Like a haiku, it constructs the situation that's not in it. Another one was, these are in quotation marks, well, he loved me, loved certain of my behaviors. One-line poems in other languages. I don't know much about this subject. The Russian futurist poet Vladimir Brusov, who was for a while Isadora Duncan's lover, in the first issue of an image-centered manifesto in a new literary magazine, published the following one-line poem, "Oh, her white thighs on the bicycle like fish in the brilliant river leaping." Then he revised it and wrote a new manifesto for the second issue, and it went, "Oh, her white thighs like fish in the brilliant river." And then in the fourth issue, aiming at greater purity and concentration, he published this version, "Oh, her white thighs." Maybe that's enough on play of one. You see what I'm after here? The leap here is to think about how one's work, the next part of it is a discussion of the use of one line as a basic rhythmic base of a poem as you build it, and probably the first and most primitive kinds of poems were built out of them. That is to say, saying the same thing over and over again, and the two forms of that are the lament and the dirge in our literature. The litany and the lament, or the litany and the dirge. And this opens a really interesting additional thing about this business of the kind of play that special forms make, and that is that when I thought about litany, I thought immediately of I have a bunch of examples here, but you can call them to mind, of basically repetitious forms. Usually they're forms of praise. I had a Roman Catholic childhood. Hail Mary, full of grace, greeting and flattery. The Lord is with thee, flattery. Blessed art thou amongst women, flattery. And blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus, flattery. Holy Mary, Mother of God, flattery. How long can this go on, and where is it going? To the request. Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death, amen. So the litany, it turns out, which is the form of the praise poem, which as it evolves, it's going to evolve into the ode as a big elaborate praise form, is piling up as a form of repetition, as a form of offering something to a power that we want something from. And that made me also think of a wonderful moment in one of the poems in our workshop, when Melanie Moreau-Huber, describing being in a kiva and seeing the light comes in, suddenly makes a prayer to the weaver woman of Navajo mythology, who's a figure somewhere between Hera. See the diamond, stairway diamond into light there at the ceiling. Nohuka diandine, Escalante ancestor, O voiceless one, O weaver woman, stagger the wind. Steal our names from thunder, toss them in a moon puddle to soak past dawn. Then when sun is high, and anyway, as you can see, it breaks from, the natural movement is from litany to supplication. That's a basic movement. And when I thought about dirge, which is just to say whoa, whoa, whoa over and over again, the form that came to my mind, a poem I can't recite all of. Brightness falls from the air. Nothing thrives that is fair. Timor mortis conturbat me. Mark, I think that's in your golden anthology, isn't it? That gorgeous poem. It's just pure statement of sorrow. Where does that go? Well, it goes toward the elegy. And then I thought, really, in a certain way, beginning with this idea of a single line making a thing, there are really only two kinds of poem. Really, all there are is litanies and dirges, turning into odes and elegies, which is to say, poems in which we're trying to get into right relation to a power that can make us more alive, or poems to try to escape a power that can kill us. Because the problem of the elegy is how to survive the grief of living. And one can study then those structures, the structure of the ode and the elegy, as ritual and symbolic forms of rhythm that try to answer the question of how we dance in this both wonderful and terrible dance of living. And this would be a way of playing out those forms. Interesting, yes. Interesting stuff that happens in what we do. So there's much more on one, but I'm going to skip quickly to two, just to say one line is a form in the sense that any gesture is a form. Two lines introduce the idea of form as an energy of relation. The first question is, what formal devices make a pair of lines, give a pair of lines two-ness? There are two basic formal devices in English poetry. The first is aural, rhyme. The second is visual, stanza patterning. But actually there are many more that are more subtle, and that has to do with either grammatical parallelism or the fact that they complete a unit. What'll I do when you... It's what'll I do? But another one would be, what was the one I was after? It was an if-then structure. Oh, I'm going to come to it at the end, which will be soon. But I want to just say, this is what I have to condense into about 2 minutes, but maybe enough of it to give you the idea. Two-ness in poetry, first of all, as it connects by parallel, is saying these things go together. So it's a small statement of some kind of completion, some kind of connection. And because it's so often, in English anyway, connected to rhyme, it's interesting to think about the lines in Emerson's poem Merlin, in which he says, describing a New England spring, the animals are sick with love, love sick with rhyme. Rhyme as if it were sexual, as if we're always a kind of happy fitting of one thing with another. And that's one of the things that a couplet can do. It can also, the couplet can have the other terrible power of saying because of this rhythm of we want order but we don't want order, it can make you feel magic and it could make you feel trapped. I asked her to swim with me because I knew how small and blithe she was, is the rhyme that tells you the world fits very sweetly. Our fathers fenced their yards with sticks and stones and made their gardens from the red man's bones. Early Robert Lowell, an angry poem clanking out the history, the terrible and inevitable and tragic history of New England. Rhyme can do both of those things. The first thing it does is put two things together. The best known two-line poem in the European literary tradition is probably the one by Catullus. It goes, Odi et amo, quare et faciam fortassere requiris, nescio, sed fieri, sensio et excrucior. I don't have Charles Martin's translation here. He's hands down the best living or in the last 3 centuries translator of Catullus. I have Horace Gregory's translation, which goes, I hate and I love, you may well ask why, I don't know, but I feel it and I suffer. Excrucior, he says. Frank Bedard has done a wonderful imitation in Charles's terms of this poem that goes, I hate and love ignorant fish who even wants the fly while writhing. Wonderful, really good two-line poem. So it would seem that one of the natural forms of the two-line poem is based on the human pattern of exchange. I love and I know. Why? I don't know, is the second line. And that also seems to call up the pattern of question and answer, call and response. It's one of the basic forms of West African folk culture, and both the work song and the spiritual evolved from it. Who is it knows the trouble I've seen? Nobody knows but Jesus. Who's that sitting on the tree of life? He hears the Jordan roll. Wallace Stevens, in one of his handful of two-line poems, picks it up. Why nag at the idea of Hercules, Don Don? Widen your senses, all things in the sun are sun, he says. One of my favorite two-line 20th century poems is by the Slovene poet Tomas Šalamun. It goes, "Emptiness, my bride, who whistles, who listens?" Bantu combinations are folk songs. They were reprinted by Jerome Rothenberg in a book called The Technicians of the Sacred. The Bantu people of southern Africa had a game, a singing game they played when they did communal work, in which one singer, to the rhythm of the work they were doing, sang out a line, a phrase, and the second singer's job was to supply a second one that fitted by some subtle internal comparison. They were written down by a French Jesuit named Henri Junot, and they explained to him what were the delicious examples in their oral tradition. One, for example, the first singer, as they're unloading bamboo that they were cutting, says, "The elephant was killed by a small arrow." And the second one said, "The lake dries up at its edges." And they explained to Father Junot that what was wonderful about the poem was not just that the small arrow killed the big elephant the way that the small thing of evaporation killed the lake, but that the color of the mud at the edge of the dried up lake was exactly like the texture of the elephant's skin. Pretty cool. "All day I carved the ironwood stick," one person sang out. The other said, "I kept thinking what to say to her." "A crawfish tugging on my line," one of them sang out. I don't know if you've gone crawfishing. You know how that first hesitant tug they try. "A crawfish tugging on my line. I think I see someone in the distance." Others more obvious, "Crack of the tusk, voice of an angry man. Roof of an old reed hut collapsing, debt and more debt," so on. I could go on with these, with Tunis. In English, as I said, Tunis is secured by rhyme. The famous example, actually the first rhymed poem in English, according to George Saintsbury, was written in 1069 by a monk named Aldred, who lived in a monastery right next to the property of a Baron Erse, who built his castle too near the monastery and chopped down a grove of trees that Aldred was fond of. And this poem shows up in the record in 1069. "Hatest thou earth, may God thee curse." First rhymed poem in English. Anyway, there's more on that. The thing to say about threeness is its richness and its sweetness. The thing to say about fourness, triplets, Dante's terza rima, the generativeness of it. I'll say one more word here, because when we come to generativeness, this will take 1 minute and then we'll end. When we come to generativeness, think right away of this peculiar thing in Western culture of the Trinity. Where the hell did that come from? It came from the generativeness of threeness, for one thing, which father, mother, child, only they couldn't do child's mother because they were in the business of getting rid of mother gods, so they did Holy Spirit. And here's a thought that goes with Holy Spirit. Back to the grave, there were the two things. There was a symbolic action, the ram horns, and there was the rhythmic action, the rhythmic signature. We know pretty much where symbols come from, and we have a language for it. We say it comes from the unconscious, or from, in Jung, the collective unconscious, from the word hoard, from dreams, so on. Our psychology is a psychology of creativity of the unconscious, which is associated with the soul as a hoard of images. We don't have a language for the part of the creative imagination that does that makes the formal signature, that does the formal play. The Greeks made a distinction. They said they called the soul psyche, and they called the spirit, another part of the self, pneuma. And the Romans, when they translated psyche as anima, the soul, the word hoard, and pneuma they translated spiritus, the spirit. Spirit was associated with Apollo, with the shaping fire, the quick fire of imagination. You know. When Dickens said, I thought of Pickwick, that was Apollo. That was spirit, not the dream hoard. The dream hoard is the place where the other thing comes from. It's interesting that in our talk about craft and these faculties, that we don't really have a good language for the brilliance of formal play that is at the root of our art. And I think maybe that's enough. I thought we should end with a little play. So, and I said I would end with a song, but first a poem and then a song. A little poem by Robert Frost that will do the two-ness, three-ness thing again. There's a poem of his written in rhymed couplets, and it goes like this. How does it go? Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. You want to do that with me? Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Can you feel the two-nesses being dealt out here? Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. What the rhythm and repetition, all of that, the tunis would give you is inevitability. Just that's how it is. But the structure is such that the parallelism is set up outside the couplet, so that the real poem goes like this. Let's do it with me. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. First green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down today. Nothing gold can stay. Raises the hair on the back of my neck. That one savage, sad, so even, so. That's why William Dickey thought that Frost was a whiner. I thought we'd end with triplet, and we'd end with the triplet that plays off the couplet and come back to the idea of the blues into W.C. Handy. In Beale Street, he does what would be a couplet. If Beale Street could talk, then married men would take their beds and walk. But because he wants a triplet, he does what the blues does, but he does it in the reverse of the way. He repeats the first line. If Beale Street could talk, if Beale Street could talk, then married men would take their beds and walk. And the second triplet is, except one or two who never drank booze, and the blind man on the corner who sings the Beale Street blues. Thank you very much.